Up until this point in the course, we've done most of our coding in script files, which is great for learning and practicing, but Elixir projects aren't built from scratch using scripts. They're built using a tool called Mix. So what exactly is Mix? Well, Mix is an executable that's automatically installed with Elixir. But the next question you probably have is, what can you do with Mix? Mix allows you to do all sorts of things like creating a project, compiling a project, running tests, and installing and managing dependencies. These are some of the major things you can do with Mix, but there's quite a few other things you can do with Mix. For example, if I run Mix with the help option, you can see a list of Mix tasks that you can perform. For example, here's the Mix task for creating a new project, and here's the Mix task for running tests. Now, this list of Mix tasks you see right here isn't inclusive. What do I mean by this? Well, Mix is an extensible tool, and you can add new tasks from third parties, and you can even create your own Mix tasks if desired. One of the most common things to do with Mix is to create a new project, which, as you saw a moment ago, can be performed by keying Mix New, followed by a project name. When I press Enter, a new directory will be created with the name you see right here. Then within that directory, a series of other directories and files are created. This directory and all its content are the boilerplate of a Mix project. Let's take a look at some of the interesting parts of a new Mix project, starting with the mix.exs file. The mix.exs file, which is in the root of our new project directory, is a sort of configuration file for a Mix project. Now, this file is just an Elixir module, and the code has a few specific required functions, which are 2 public functions, project and application, and 1 private function, deps. Before we start looking at these functions, take a look at this line right here, use mix.project. You just learned about the using macro, which is a macro that allows you to extend the current module with code from another module, and in this case, the Mix project module. You don't necessarily need to know specifically what it's doing, but you should be aware that it's adding functionality to this module, and if you wanted to know exactly what it's doing, you'd just need to look at the code for this module. In particular, you'd need to look at the using macro. The first function we see in this file is the project function, and though technically it's a function because it uses the function syntax, it doesn't take any parameters, so I like to think of it as more of a constant. What's returned by the project function is a keyword list that contains the app's name, the version number for this app, the Elixir version number, the start permanent key, which defines how the Beam virtual machine should respond to certain failure scenarios, and lastly, the software dependencies this project has. The value for this key is a list that's returned from the private deps function down here, which is empty in a brand new project. The other public function is the application function here. This function gets used when you compile the Mix project. We'll take a closer look at this function and what it does in later videos. Let's take a look at the lib directory. The lib directory is the location where the vast majority of Elixir code you write will reside, with the exception of config files and test files, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, the code you write in the lib folder is code that you intend on being compiled, and as such, every file you put in the lib directory will be a .ex file, not .exs files that we've been using quite a bit with our script files. A brand new project that's created with the Mix New task will have a single file in the lib directory, which you can see here. This file isn't particularly useful. It's just an example of some of the things you can do in Elixir. Now, typically for non-trivial projects, you'll have 1 or more child folders and Elixir files within the lib directory. Let's go take a look at the test folder next. First, we'll look at the test helper file, which is a .exs or script file. Tests don't need to be compiled and included in releases, so they're created as script files. Now, the only thing in the test helper file is this call to xunit.start, which initiates or starts the unit tests using the testing framework named xunit. One way of running unit tests is by keying mix space test from within the project's root directory. And as you can see from the output, one doc test was run and one unit test was run, and there were 0 failures. So what is this test and doc test? Well, when you run mix test, the test task starts the project's application, loads the test helper, and then it loads and runs all files in the test folder or any child folders, but only when the test file ends in _test.exs. Additionally, each test file is run in parallel, so running tests is usually pretty quick. In this project, there's only one test file, which you can see here, and this file only has one test, which you can see here. Now, this test is pretty simple. It calls our module's hello function and checks that the result is the atom world. So where do you think this assert function comes from? And for that matter, where do you think this test macro comes from? Well, they come from this line of code right here, use xunit.case. This line invokes the using macro for the xunit module, which injects code that makes these functions and macros available to you. Okay, so this code here is the one test we saw reported here, but what about the one doc test? Where did that come from? Well, you see this line right here, doc test followed by our module name? This line is telling xunit to check this module for any tests that might exist in the documentation. Let's go peek at this module, which is defined in the one file in the lib directory. A long time ago, when I introduced you to docs, I showed you how actual unit tests can be created in the documentation, and that's what you're seeing right here. The way these doc tests are written is you add 4 spaces followed by the IEX syntax and a call to a function. Then whatever value is returned by this function call is compared with the value on the next line. If the value returned by this function is the same as the value placed on this line, then the test passes. This idea of including tests in your document's example code is pretty awesome because it helps you to ensure that your document's examples are always correct. As a rule of thumb, when practical, you should try to do as much testing as possible in doc tests like this because it's doing 2 things at once. It's testing and documenting your code. Just to prove that this is really a test, I'll change the expected value from the atom world to the atom whirl with the D missing off the end. Then I'll run our tests again with mixed test. And as you can see, this time our test failed, and it's telling us specifically that the failure was from a doc test for the documents in this module for the hello function. There's one more feature I want to show you before we move on to our next video, and that feature is the auto code formatting feature. You know how many of us developers love to argue over things like using tabs versus spaces, or other unproductive and sometimes trivial concerns? Well, you don't need to have those type of arguments in Elixir, because Elixir can automatically format your code for you. Let me show you. I'm going to purposely screw up the formatting of the hello function by adding an extra line above and below the atom world, and I'll add some extra white space in front of world. Now I'll go ahead and run another mix task, the format task, and then I'll pull up the file I just intentionally messed up, and check this out. The format task automatically updated the hello function to an agreeable format. Nice. Now, in truth, and I suspect most people, don't actually use the mix format command, as you just saw. I actually have my editor format the Elixir file every time I save the file. Most popular editors support features like this. Okay, now that you know about Mix, I'd like to create a simple application in a Mix project, but before we do that, I want to talk about what it means to write an application using functional programming techniques, and that's what we'll do in the next video.